So, Karen and Megan, thank you so much for being here at Enabling this year. We're really thrilled that you're here to talk with us and with all of our guests at the summit about smart cities and being an inclusive smart city. We've been fortunate to be partnering both with the City of Chicago and with Microsoft over the months and really years now about these issues of deploying technology, deploying accessible technology, and more recently, how do we focus that approach to deploying accessible technology that works for everyone in cities? So, I think you know, and certainly Megan, you know, because Microsoft has been such a strategic partner for us. With our Smart Cities for All initiative 3 years ago, we launched it in partnership with World Enabled and Dr. Victor Pineda to really look at this issue of the digital transformation of cities. They're investing trillions of dollars in technology worldwide, and people are moving into cities at really significant rates. What does that mean for people with disabilities? What does that mean for how we think about technology to support all of these amazing functions and services that cities like Chicago provide? So I'd love to chat with you a little bit about smart approaches to being an inclusive smart city. But maybe before we jump into it, it would be great to hear from you, Karen, maybe starting with you, a little bit about your role and what that means from your position in the City of Chicago. And then your position at Microsoft, why is it important in that role? What does your role bring to making cities smarter and more inclusive?
Sure. So I'm the commissioner for the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities for the City of Chicago. And really my role of my department is to make Chicago a fully accessible and inclusive city for people with all types of disabilities that live in Chicago and visit Chicago. Our work cuts across many different areas, so we deliver direct services, we do a lot of education on disability issues, but we really work on accessibility policy and compliance and making sure that across the board, you know, we are a city that delivers services and information and programs that's accessible to people with disabilities. We've definitely seen this shift over the years as we move towards becoming more and more of a smart city, deploying technology to improve services, to make service delivery more efficient, to do things to improve the lives of our residents. And so really seeing the city as virtual city hall now. How we do business at the city isn't like you walk in anymore. I mean, you can still do that, right? But there's so much you can do from home, from your computer, your smartphone, you know, get services, get information, apply for a permit, apply for a job, those types of things. And so much of my role now is shifted in terms of the digital space and really trying to make all of those services and information accessible for people with disabilities.
Fantastic. And I know just from the work that we've done, all of us have done in partnership with Chicago, that you guys are really in the middle of this thinking through and acting on what does it mean to be smart?
Yeah.
And importantly from your office,
right.
What does it mean to be inclusive as part of being smart?
Yes.
And Megan, maybe a little bit of introduction and sort of your perspective from your pretty unique kind of role that you play at Microsoft.
Yeah, so I'm the senior accessibility evangelist, which means I get to work deeply with the disability community, NGOs, and certainly our customers like the City of Chicago to not only drive awareness and education around the accessibility that we have built in to the Microsoft suite, but certainly what we are helping our customers build, right? Recently I heard the quote that it's not what Microsoft builds, we should be the softest voice in the room, it's really what we empower other people to build. When we think about the city as really the place where people with disabilities live, work, and play, and the amount of technology that we increasingly see being built into the city, this is such an important topic to get our hands around now and to make sure we're building inclusive infrastructure all the way from the sidewalk to the website.
Fantastic. So I mentioned, and you guys have both been partners, when we launched the Smart Cities for All initiative globally, the first thing we did in this project, Smart Cities for All, was we actually did a global study to get an understanding of how are cities thinking about being inclusive, or are they even thinking about it as part of being a smart city. We did roundtables in smart cities around the world. We did a survey of 250 experts around the world. And what we found, unfortunately, it sort of proved our hypothesis, is that today, smart cities, cities that are deploying technology, and as you know, really every city in the world is deploying technology on some level, big cities, small cities. Smart cities are actually making the digital divide worse, not better for people with disabilities. And you can find all this data on our website. As a result of that, we started to look at, including with our partners, what are some key challenges? What are some tools we can develop to help cities be more inclusive as they're being smarter? One of them that I want to talk a little bit about with you guys today is the Smart Cities for All Digital Inclusion Maturity Model, which is basically an assessment tool that looks at the key variables that are important to any smart city, things like the use of technology, the use of data, the culture, and what does it mean to leverage those variables to also be inclusive, or not? Karen, you were the first city
Yes.
that raised their hand and said, we're ready to try this. We want a team to come in and evaluate us using this tool. Can you talk to us a little bit sort of at a high level of why that was important, why you saw it as an opportunity to be the first city to sign up and work with us in this evaluation and assessment tool?
Sure. So, I mean, we had been working on digital inclusion for a while, but I think the world is quickly changing. Technologies are changing. It's difficult to get a handle on everything that the city is deploying, and for us, it came really at the right time. It was, an opportunity, I think, to really elevate the work that we're doing on this. It brought credibility with Microsoft being involved in G3 ICT, particularly within the city, the mayor's office, within other city departments, to know that really this isn't just an initiative of the mayor's office for people with disabilities, but this is an initiative that really involves and needs the support of all of the departments and the budget office and the mayor's office around leadership and vision and things like that. So it came at a really great time for us. It was also the time when, we had a mayoral transition, and
Which every city does eventually.
exactly, right. And so I think that was a great thing. The timing was absolutely perfect in terms of having kind of this next generation, new administration come in to be able to say, look, here's a roadmap for how Chicago can up its game around being a digital inclusive smart city and thinking about that. And so for us, I think it's just having something to say, these are the steps, these are the things that we have to look at that we maybe haven't even looked at or prioritized as an issue, right? Or we're focusing a lot of attention over here, but it kind of brought to the forefront that we also need to be paying attention over here, here, and here. And so for us, it's really that roadmap for how we're going to be using this as a living, breathing document going forward to really, up our level of maturity.
Great. And as we start to dig into some of these variables, it'll be great to hear you talk a little bit about how you and some of your colleagues in the city are actually using this moving forward.
Yes.
Megan, you have a lot of experience working with cities around the world. Can you talk a little bit about why assessments, why metrics matters or can be useful?
Over the last couple of years, I've talked to close to 70 cities. Earlier, you said that's probably an underestimate of the number of cities and city officials that we've spoken to. And almost every single one of them has said that accessibility and disability inclusion is key to their city's success and certainly their long-term sustainability. But oftentimes when we said, well, how accessible is your city? The question was, well, I don't really know, or I'm unsure. And so to me, the maturity model is a way to really get their arms around how accessible am I? Maturity models have been used for a very long time in technology and other types of cultural work to be able to build that assessment and that tool to evaluate growth and success over time. And certainly the inclusive smart city maturity model is no different in really helping cities not only evaluate where they are today, but how they want to grow into the future.
Great. And so in the maturity model, in this assessment tool, which really is Karen, as you were saying, it's a way to have a conversation with a city, but also within your city about some key variables. And we've in the model created a sort of 5 buckets of really important variables that we know are important to smart cities, and that can either be supporters of greater inclusion or barriers, depending on how the city is approaching them. One of them that's key, that maybe we can start talking about this variable with you, Karen, is the strategy and the vision. And how does that play into a city, a big city, lots of technology deployments, lots of diverse communities that you're working with. How does strategy and vision play a role in being an inclusive smart city?
I would say it's number one, and I would say it's also kind of where you start, because I believe you have to set the vision from the top, the highest level in government, to be able to say, this is what we're committed to doing, this is our mission. So I think having that vision and then having like a strategy that's operational, and how you achieve that mission is really critical for laying that roadmap and being able to get things done. And when you have the buy-in from the top levels of government, it's so much easier to make things happen, right?
And when you're talking about the top levels of government, you're talking the mayor, the city council, commissioners?
All of the above, right? And so I think, and it also sets a priority citywide that this isn't just an initiative of my department, this is something we all have to own. And if we're truly talking about equity, we're truly talking about having a livable city for everybody, this has to be an integral part of not just the conversation, but really the execution.
And a piece of this vision and strategy piece is the leadership. You've been talking about that, and when we visited, and both of us were part of this pilot process with you and using the tool in Chicago, we talked a lot about leadership. And I know, Karen, over the years, we've had a lot of conversations about the unique role that you and some of your colleagues around across the U.S. and around the world play as commissioners of disability. Can you talk a little bit about that piece of leadership and the importance of someone on point, maybe with a department or maybe not, but at least focused on making sure that inclusion and equity and accessibility is a part of technology discussions?
Well, I've been very fortunate to have a strong working relationship with our CIO, who has been a really, really critical part of making this happen, who gets it, who's helping to drive a lot of the initiatives within her department, because it can't just be my department, it has to be both. And so the fact that we've long-term been able to work together, I think, has really accelerated the work that we do. I also think that being connected with other city commissioners around the country who are in my similarly situated role in New York and LA and other cities is really great, because we can share ideas about what are best practices to really move the needle forward on digital inclusion. And it was only a couple of months ago that I was calling up New York because they were deploying kiosks. We were deploying kiosks. And what were your lessons learned? And our local government was really interested in talking to New York about, like, how did that work on an accessibility front, And so just having those networks are really also important in making sure that you're deploying, products that are accessible to everybody, including people with disabilities.
One of my favorite points about the kiosk example that you give is the importance of that citizen engagement, of having people with disabilities as part of the way that you not only think about what products to buy, but how they're used in the daily life. Tell us a little bit more about how you engage citizens in Chicago.
Yeah, and I probably should have even included as part of like my overall vision strategy, because getting buy-in at the highest level of government is really important, but you need community buy-in too.
Yeah.
I mean, because ultimately that's who you're designing for, right? Is for your residents. And so we have a very strong working relationship with the disability community, and I think that's probably one of the key factors, because if something's not accessible, we hear about it. And so we work very, very hard to get people with disabilities involved from the very beginning, from the get-go, right? So we had kiosks, that we're now kind of on our 3rd generation model, and, over time it got more and more accessible. So we're finally getting to the place where I'm feeling with a higher degree of confidence that this is going to really meet the needs of the disability community. And it's because the vendor that we were working with proactively said, we want the blind community to help us figure out the navigation and the audio output, and we want wheelchair users to come and test, the functionality of the reach ranges and the buttons and the glare and the tilt of the screen and things like that. And so I couldn't say with confidence that we would be ever a fully inclusive digital city if we didn't have the input and the buy-in and the expertise of the disability community.
And another piece of this vision and strategy variable or dimension that we had a lot of discussions with you and your colleagues in Chicago is around the business case for inclusion. That we need to, as we're becoming smarter cities, becoming more inclusive cities, we need to move beyond just legal compliance drivers for being inclusive to really there's a broader business case.
Yeah.
And I think you have some great success stories in making the business case to get more resources, more FTE, not just in your department but in other departments. Can you talk a little bit about that? And Megan, if you want to weigh in on that as well from your experience with other cities, that would be great.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, compliance can be, I think it's good in a way because it keeps you honest and it keeps you understanding and realizing what has to be done, right? So there's always an effort to be compliant, but I think making the argument just simply from that legal compliance, we're going to get sued perspective isn't, in my mind, the best way to go. I think it should be more of an equity issue and thinking about how we include all of our citizens, all of our residents. And so I think that really has to be part of your overall high-level strategy, that this is about equity, this is about inclusion, this is about civil and human rights.
I often say that an investment in accessibility is an investment in innovation.
Definitely.
Right? We're thinking about driving natural user interface design, thinking about how technology honestly gets developed and used by a broader range of people. And to me, that is equally as important as a business case, which is the usability and really helping your citizens do what they need and want.
Exactly, because when you design things to be accessible, everyone can use them, right?
Sure.
And you find more and more people without disabilities using accessible products, right? Because it helps them. And so I agree. I think that's really, really important.
So, Megan, another big piece of the puzzle when we're looking at inclusive smart cities and evaluating them and understanding them is culture. And I know culture is a big part of your job as an evangelist in the partners and clients and customers that you're working with. Can you talk a little bit about what does it mean from a culture perspective for a smart city to also be an inclusive smart city?
I think often about how we really embed accessibility and disability inclusion as a core part or really getting into the DNA of any organization, whether it's Microsoft, G3ICT, or the city of Chicago. And I think to me, there's many aspects, but two things I want to talk about specifically today, which is really bringing the inclusive hiring to bear. So how do we continue to make sure that the city of Chicago is empowered to hire people with disabilities? And one of those ways, I believe, is through great digital tools. So, being a partner with you, I believe that Microsoft, is deeply passionate and thankful that we can help you build a digital culture of inclusion that, can help boost your hiring of people with disabilities. So we really bring their voice into every single thing that you do. And it's also about communication. So how is it that not only is the city communicating out to its citizens, think of all of the ways that we communicate in today's world, Twitter, you have a Twitter handle, right? Yeah. But then also the way that citizens can engage back with you, and that's really your 311 system. Tell us more about that, because I was blown away when you talked about how your 311 system was accessible and really using the disability community to make that happen.
Sure. So 311 is a system where customers can, previously, before we launched the mobile app, was really just a phone call or texting, any kind of city services. A tree has fallen in my neighborhood, or there's a rat problem, or whatever the issue might be.
Things that happen in cities every day. Right.
Right. There's a pothole, where you report those types of things, and then those requests get divvied out to the relevant departments to fix. And so we just went mobile app, which I think is great for so many of our residents, and we really engaged the disability community on making sure that that mobile app was accessible, and that people with disabilities were actually testing it before it went live, and that was really, really important to me. I think one of my indicators that we may have gotten it right on that front was just the fact that, I heard blind people recommending it to other blind people. And so to me, that was very affirming.
Great.
That, yes, it was something that they could use. And I think that's a really other kind of important piece of it is when you deploy technologies that you've worked really hard to make it accessible, it's really important to let the public know that it's accessible and usable for you, right? Because I feel like sometimes so much of what we do is the best kept secret. And it's also another challenge to make sure people know it's available to them, right?
You've described a couple of different technology deployments in Chicago, one around kiosks a little bit, and certainly we heard a lot about in our work with you, the new 311 system. And it sounds like with the 311 system, you're rightfully quite proud that you did have a process at the beginning to make sure that smart city solution, and we see cities around the world deploying citizen engagement channels like that, some more accessible and inclusive than others, but it sounds like you guys had a process to think about that as you were with your IT department, with your CIO, to make sure that it was accessible and inclusive. One of the key pillars of understanding and making progress on an inclusive smart city is technology, obviously. It's about smart cities and deploying technology. So that's a real pillar of our work with this tool. Can both of you actually, and Megan, if you want to chime in first, when we're talking about technology assets and deploying technology assets, what are some of the ways we need to be thinking about them to make sure that we have a 311 system that or any other smart solution that they really do work for people with a range of disabilities? And I know, Karen, your office is working with citizens and people in the community who have every kind of disability.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think you need a diversity of people with disabilities to test things out. It's actually just this week, a transit authority had contacted me for the region. They provide paratransit services to literally tens of thousands of people, and they were asking me, so we're going to use user testing. I've been pressing them on this. What are the types of functionalities we should be looking at? So, I was able to provide them a list of different types of things that they should be looking at, text-to-speech and keyboards and JAWS and different types of things, so that they're really making sure that once they do launch their website, that it is fully accessible and thoughtful of people with all types of different disabilities. And so I think that's really important. If you, as a city or any entity, right, is going to deploy anything, you do have to really make sure that you're mindful of being as broad as you possibly can.
And having a process in place to make sure that you're evaluating these assets.
Absolutely.
As you're procuring them and as you're deploying them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A big part of thinking about the technology assets is making sure that what we are buying and deploying is accessible and everyone can use it. But another way within the model that we're thinking about technology is, are we using technology in creative and innovative ways to solve long-standing accessibility challenges in cities, in urban environments? And Megan, I've heard you talk about several companies actually that are using technology in creative ways to get at some of the big pain points that commissioners like Karen have every day, that they're like curb cuts, in figuring out what is the accessibility of our streetscape here in Chicago or in Sao Paulo or wherever. Maybe talk a little bit about how we can be thinking about deploying technology in innovative ways.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct that the physical environment has long been a standing potential barrier for people with disabilities. And there is a company called Cyclomedia that is looking at using high resolution imagery and LiDAR data to really understand the streetscape at a very fine scale. They worked with the city of New York to help them not only understand where all the curb cuts are in the city, but certainly where those places are that they wanted to start investing to improve the infrastructure. So to me, part of what the Smart City Maturity Model does is really helps the city think about that data-driven investment strategy over time, because no city is going to be able to solve every accessibility problem in a short period of time. Instead, it's really that long play and that journey where we're using great disability data and technology together to think about what the future looks like.
Great. So another big piece of the puzzle is the city's processes. And Karen, you know better than anyone. Cities have, they're big, many of them. They have a lot of processes. Are those processes, whether it's procurement or training or communications, are those processes supporting greater inclusion as part of being a smart city? Maybe talk, both of you, a little bit about process and how that can help a city be more inclusive and smarter.
Definitely. Everything that you just mentioned is absolutely critical because, yes, you have to have the high-level vision, right? Setting the tone, what we want to see, what's our vision for the city, inclusion, equity, right? But then how are you operationalizing that? So how are you thinking about your gatekeeping systems, your procurement processes, to make sure that what you buy is accessible? What standards are you using? Are you adopting standards for your city, citywide?
I know you've had in Chicago, thanks to your leadership, largely a bit of a journey in terms of standards and finding the right set of robust global accessibility standards.
Yeah, and we started out probably 10, 12 years ago using the state standards, accessible technology standards, which were largely developed with the state government and with the disability community. Those really similarly mirrored 508 in the sense that it only related to state agencies, but at the time they were current, right? So now we're moving to more WCAG standards as the standards that the city will follow. So I think having a set of standards of what you need to do, because a lot of departments say, just tell me what I need to do, right? Just tell me what I should follow, or vendors say that. And so I think once you have that in place, it's really important. And I'll tell you why procurement is important, because we had something that, we had some software that we put out that would affect a large number of people, large numbers of the public, and discovered through some complaints from the blind community that wasn't accessible. But because we had procurement language in the contract for the vendor, we were able to go back and get them to fix it at their cost.
Smart.
Right? So it can save you money down the road to go back and fix it. So that's really important. I think training is extremely important because, to me, that's part of the culture, right? Building culture, building an awareness. Half the time things get deployed because people just don't even think about it, or they don't understand what accessible technology means. I think we get what a ramp and a widened door and an elevator means to someone with a physical disability, but I think we're not yet there in thinking about what does accessible technology really mean. And that needs some conversation, right? And so not just educating on what this is, but also educating on how you do it. So when you have multiple, 40 different departments all putting up content on their own websites, how do you control that? Well, you can control it through educating people that, and this is the policy, that you won't put a video up that's not captioned, or, you'll tag your photos, that type of thing. And so I think all of those pieces are really important to really, I think, executing your strategy.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's not just what you buy from vendors, but increasingly what you make. I mean, the city of Chicago is making its own applications.
That's right.
And so making sure that you have that level of awareness and accessibility training with the wonderful folks within your own city that are building tools as well. And having that governance model over time, so being able to track how accessible is this and are we meeting those targets as we move forward.
I'm glad you brought that up because, Karen, you were talking about systems and operations, and Megan, you're exactly right that we see more and more cities, big and small, developing their own solutions and deploying them. One of the great things that I think Chicago did, that I've seen some other cities do as well, is a couple things actually. One is you were successful in making the business case to get more accessibility-focused IT professionals in the city, working with your CIO. Great. One of the first things that person did that we learned as part of this, Megan, was they built into the city's design guide accessibility.
Exactly.
So that's part of the blueprint for anything that any other IT professionals in the city are doing. Accessibility is baked in from the start, which I think is fantastic.
Front and center, right there when you open it up, which I think is great because we also have to see cities as, because they have the purse strings, they can help change the landscape around vendors, right? So if a vendor knows, I'm not going to be able to operate in the city or sell my product to the city if it's not accessible because they're not going to buy it, like that could change the landscape of the vendors. And so we have to see the buying power of cities as another lever to moving this forward.
And Megan, it would be great to hear, as a vendor to many cities around the world, maybe hear you weigh in on that a little bit. And a big part of the maturity model in the kinds of conversations and evaluations we're doing with cities is around partnerships. We've talked about partnerships with disability organizations and the disability community, but it's also partnerships with vendors and maybe changing that relationship to help them, vendors, help you be better at being inclusive and smarter.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the tools that G3ICT came out with earlier this year that I've been really impressed with was the 10 questions anybody should ask their vendor before buying technology. Because I think you're right, oftentimes we hear that from cities as well. Well, I want to be more accessible, tell me what to do. And so, that's a tool that I think can be incredibly useful. But I think it's about being a trusted partner instead of coming in to sell you any suite of tools, no matter what company you are. It's about listening to the challenges that you want to solve. It's about listening to the vision that you want to enact, and then doing that as a partnership together. I think that's an incredibly powerful, really fun place to be,
Right.
Because then it becomes about how do we work together to find that mutual interest.
Yeah.
And I think part of the process of working with Chicago, and again, we're so honored that you invited us in to do this work with you, is that process and you pulling in department leads and other leaders within the city really does uncover some of those key pain points and challenges.
Yeah.
And together, you guys were able to start conversations, and hopefully the roadmap, as a result of working with the maturity model tool, hopefully that roadmap has helped you with your colleagues work on some of those priority pain points.
For sure. Yeah, it's been able to get investment from other departments who might not have otherwise been invested in this, and so.
And I know one of the key areas that we had some really rich conversations about, and I know in the roadmap that we delivered to you as a result of the process, a priority area was around data, and that's really the fifth variable or group of variables that we look at when we're talking with cities about being inclusive and smart. Karen, maybe talk a little bit about what you and your CIO, I know you're having some conversations about data, and Megan, I know you have some really strong opinions on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think data was probably the area where we needed to most step it up, and really seeing how there's not a lot of data that we have on our portal that's disability or accessibility focused. And I've seen more and more over the years how the disability community wants that, right?
Yeah.
They want to know, where are my accessible curb cuts? They want to know which schools are accessible. They want to know which transit stops are accessible. They want this information. And then you get, app developers who want to start helping the disability community, get the information that they need to navigate the city, and this information is critical, right? And so, but if there's no data out there for them to take advantage of, I think we're doing a disservice to the disability community as well. So for us, data is probably, one of the areas that we're really looking at focusing on next as part of our maturity model, and just trying to figure out, what are those key things that the disability community has most wanted to see? What's the low-hanging fruit that we know we can get right now on the city's open data portal? Yeah. Because you do see how it can improve people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, data is the lifeblood of the smart city. I think, James, I'm stealing that from you because it really is so true. And I think when we think about data in the context of the maturity model, really when we want to think about being at that 4 or that 5, it requires data to not only understand, well, how well is the system working, but, how do I then take the next step? When I think about data, I often think about the company Move It. It's the #1 transit app in the world. They are localized to 44 languages. They have 300 million users, I believe. It's a fully accessible app that they have developed with the blind community. It's got wheelchair routing through several cities. And now they are putting all of that rich geospatial accessibility data on Azure Maps. Again, it's really about empowering any city around the world that wants to think about mobility and transportation as, again, that fundamental human right, right, as you said, and really sharing and, again, creating that partnership, not only with organizations like Microsoft, but, again, that city.
The other thing I'm finding more and more like a need for data is around equity. So are certain kind of accessibility features equally dispersed throughout the city in certain neighborhoods? And unfortunately, I don't have that information, but that's an area I think that can help answer some of those questions too around equity and the delivery of services or accessibility.
And to that point, and Karen, I've heard you speak about this passionately. We can design cities that are completely accessible from a technology perspective and use universal design principles. But if we're not tackling the data divide and the digital divide as part of that, if people with disabilities don't have access to devices, don't have connectivity, don't have the digital literacy skills to use those services, we're still not really promoting inclusion in these smart cities. And maybe both of you want to just, and that's built into the model as well, is how is a smart city thinking about dealing with the baseline data and digital divides? Maybe weigh in a little bit on that because it's so important.
I mean, if you're not thinking about both, just being a smart city can widen the digital divide for people with disabilities. And so that's a big issue that we see in our service delivery, is that so many of our city services, our state services, our human services that people with disabilities rely on and need are all online. And so if you don't have connectivity, which studies have shown there's still neighborhoods where over half of the residents don't have internet subscriptions, right? If you don't have a smartphone or even a computer at home, how do you get access to be able to complete these applications? And then having the digital literacy skills, the confidence to be able to complete these applications. And so, we can make all of our deployments as accessible as they need to be, but if people can't utilize them, I think in many ways we're cutting people off, we're further isolating them, and we're further exacerbating poverty.
Right. And Megan, I remember as we were doing the engagement with the City of Chicago, one of the things I think we felt was pretty exciting as the team that went in to work with you is, Karen, as you bringing together all these various departments over a few days, we learned, and I think some of your colleagues learned as well, that I think it was the libraries were actually doing some really innovative training on accessibility for people in the community. And I think it was someone from the community centers that was thinking, we can use that in our work. And they were sort of learning from each other real time,
right.
which I think is a great outcome of doing this sort of self-reflection and evaluation process.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like I said, it has to be a team effort, but it's good to know what every department is doing, because some are farther ahead in their own delivery of accessible, services than others are, and they can learn from each other just within your own city, right? And I think it's kind of neat to see that, because the libraries, for example, get a lot of traffic, and a lot of people with disabilities use the library systems. So without even our prompting, they're seeing this huge need to really make a lot of their offerings accessible.
So it's been great working with you over the months and years on these issues, and having this conversation with you about what it means to really be an inclusive smart city. Maybe to wrap up, just from both of you, one last thing, or something that a city that may be starting this journey or and think about accessibility and inclusion and being a smart city, one key takeaway, one first step to get them started down the journey, and maybe starting with you, because I like how you talk about this is a journey for all of us that are involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, after having had conversations with city leaders, across the world, it's become clear to me that people are ready. We've really moved from why is this important to how do we implement this today. So, my biggest takeaway is take the challenge, take on the maturity model, because I think you were correct in that self-reflection. The city not only learns from itself and from each other, but it really does help begin to put those next steps in place.
Karen?
I just think if you're starting this, you have to engage people with disabilities from the get-go, right? They're your end users. They're what helps you define an accessible city. From developing your strategy to implementing your strategy, people with disabilities need to be part of that process and conversation.
Great. Thank you both for your leadership and for
you.
sharing all of this with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.